Daniel Harper's boots scuffed the weathered planks of the Copper Ridge platform, his fingers tightening around the crumpled letter in his pocket. The October air bit at his knuckles, sharp with the promise of frost, but it was the weight of hope that made his chest ache. For 2 years, Elizabeth Carter's words had filled his evenings, elegant loops of ink promising a life beyond the solitude of his Colorado farm. Today, she was to step off the Denver train, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, her smile banishing the loneliness that had haunted him since his brother's death in the war. He straightened his new vest, bought with 3 months' savings, and scanned the horizon where black smoke curled like a warning. The train's whistle pierced the morning, a mournful cry that set Daniel's heart hammering. Wheels screeched against iron rails, and the locomotive shuddered to a halt, belching steam that stung his eyes. Passengers spilled onto the platform, a businessman in a crisp suit, a woman with weary eyes clutching 2 bags, an elderly conductor wiping soot from his brow. Daniel's gaze darted among them, searching for the woman whose photograph he had memorized, a delicate jaw, eyes bright with quiet strength. But the platform emptied, and Elizabeth did not appear. His stomach twisted, a knot of dread tightening with each passing second. "Harper?" The conductor's voice was gruff, his face etched with something Daniel could not place. Pity, perhaps, or unease. The man approached, holding an envelope marked with Daniel's name in Elizabeth's familiar script. Before he could speak, a sound cut through the dissipating steam, the high, broken cries of children. Daniel turned, and his breath caught. From the last car emerged a tragic procession. 6 small figures, their clothes torn and streaked with dirt, their faces hollow with grief. The oldest, a girl of about 12 with matted brown hair, carried a baby no older than 2, whose whimpers rose like a plea. 3 boys and another girl huddled behind her, their eyes wide with fear, clinging to one another as if the world might swallow them whole. The conductor cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to the envelope. "This came with them. You'd best read it." Daniel's hands trembled as he took the letter, the paper soft and worn, as if it had been held through fevered nights. His eyes flicked to the children, who watched him with a desperate intensity that made his throat burn. The oldest girl stepped forward, her chin raised despite the tears carving paths through the dust on her cheeks. "You're Mr. Harper, aren't you?" Her voice cracked, heavy with exhaustion. "Miss Elizabeth said you'd be waiting. She said you were a good man." Daniel's fingers faltered on the envelope, his mind reeling. "Where is she?" he asked, though the conductor's grim expression already told him the answer. The man sighed, glancing at the children as if they carried a burden too heavy for their small frames. "Miss Carter passed 3 days ago. Fever took her, but she made arrangements before the end. These children, they're yours now if you'll have them." The words landed like a blow, stealing the air from Daniel's lungs. Elizabeth was gone. The future he had built in his mind, quiet evenings by the fire, her laughter filling his cabin, dissolved into the cold morning air. He tore open the letter, his hands shaking as he unfolded the single page. Elizabeth's handwriting, usually so precise, was unsteady, the ink smudged with desperation. "My dearest Daniel, if you read this, I have been called to God before we could meet. My heart breaks for the life we planned, but I beg you, do not let my death be in vain. These 6 children have no one. Their parents perished in a fire last month, and the orphanage has closed its doors. I have seen your kindness in your letters, your gentle hands in the wooden horse you carved. They need a home, Daniel, and I believe you are the man to give it to them. Please, for me, take them in. Yours in eternity, Elizabeth." Daniel's vision blurred, the words swimming before his eyes. He looked at the children, their faces gray with hunger, their clothes barely holding together. The baby in the girl's arms let out a weak, hungry cry that cut through him like a blade. The oldest girl, Sarah, she said her name was, clutched the baby tighter, her eyes never leaving his. "Miss Elizabeth promised us you'd take care of us," she whispered. "She said you had a farm, a place where we could be safe." Safe. The word echoed in Daniel's mind, mocking the reality of his life. His cabin was barely big enough for one, its pantry stocked for a single winter. He had prepared for a wife, not a family of 6 orphans. Winter was 8 weeks away, and his savings would not stretch to feed 7 mouths. Yet as he met Sarah's gaze, something shifted in his chest, a flicker of duty, or perhaps the ghost of Elizabeth's faith in him. The conductor shifted impatiently, checking his pocket watch. "I need an answer, Harper. These children can't stay here. Either you take them or they go to the workhouse in Denver. Most don't last 6 months in that place." The threat hung in the air, heavy as the coal smoke. Daniel's mind raced. If he said no, he would condemn these children to a fate worse than death. If he said yes, he would risk everything: his farm, his savings, his very survival. Sarah reached into her tattered dress and pulled out a small wooden horse, its paint chipped but carefully carved. "Miss Elizabeth showed us this," she said, her voice trembling. "She said it proved you had a kind heart." Daniel recognized it instantly, the gift he had sent Elizabeth months ago, a token of his craftsmanship. Now it was a lifeline, binding him to these children and the woman who had trusted him with their lives. The baby's cries grew softer, her tiny face pinched with hunger. Daniel closed his eyes, the platform's creaking boards and the distant clatter of luggage fading into silence. He saw his brother's face, pale and still after Shiloh, and felt the old ache of failing someone he loved. When he opened his eyes, 6 pairs of desperate eyes were still fixed on him, waiting for a choice that would shape their fate. "Load their things into my wagon," he told the conductor, his voice thick with resolve. "They're coming home with me." The relief on Sarah's face nearly broke him. "Thank you, Papa Daniel," she whispered, the word Papa, landing like a stone in his heart. As they moved toward his wagon, the weight of his decision settled over him, heavy as the storm clouds gathering above Copper Ridge. He had no idea that the choice he had just made was only the beginning of a fight far greater than hunger or winter, a fight that would test every ounce of his courage and change him forever. Daniel Harper's wagon creaked along the dusty road from Copper Ridge, the weight of 6 children making the old wood groan. The October sun hung low, casting long shadows across the scrubland, but its warmth did little to ease the chill in Daniel's bones. The letter from Elizabeth Carter lay folded in his vest pocket, its words burned into his mind like a brand. She was gone, and in her place, these children, strangers with hollow cheeks and frightened eyes, now called him Papa. The word felt foreign, heavy with a responsibility he had not sought. He gripped the reins, his knuckles whitening as the reality of his choice sank deeper. Sarah sat beside him on the wagon's bench, clutching little Lily, whose ragged doll dangled from her tiny hands. The other 4 children, Lucas, Matthew, Anna, and Benjamin, huddled in the back, their small bodies pressed together against the jolting ride. Lucas, the pale boy with a cough that rattled his thin frame, stared silently at the passing landscape, while Anna whispered something to Benjamin, who clutched a tattered blanket like a shield. Their silence was louder than any cry, a testament to the losses they had already endured. Daniel glanced at them, his chest tightening. He had planned for a honeymoon, not this, a procession of orphans trailing his every step. The wagon rolled past the general store, where old Pete leaned against the porch rail, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Daniel's cargo. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, paused mid-conversation with a neighbor, her lips pursing in disapproval. Daniel felt their stares like stones against his back, each one a reminder of Copper Ridge's small, judgmental heart. He had lived here 5 years, a quiet farmer keeping to himself, but today he was a spectacle, a fool who had taken on more than he could handle. He straightened, forcing his gaze forward. Let them judge. He had made a promise, even if it was to a woman he would never hold. "Papa Daniel," Sarah's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "Lily hasn't eaten since yesterday morning, and Lucas—" She hesitated, glancing at the boy in the back. "His cough's getting worse. He was spitting blood on the train." Daniel's stomach lurched. He had noticed Lucas's labored breathing, the way his shoulders hunched with each ragged exhale. A sick child, a starving baby, and winter looming like a vulture. His modest savings would not stretch far enough to meet these needs. His cabin had one bedroom, a tiny loft, and a pantry stocked for one. The math was merciless, and it terrified him. "I'll get medicine in town tomorrow," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "And food. We'll make do." Sarah nodded, but her eyes held a flicker of doubt, as if she had heard promises before and seen them break. Daniel wanted to say more, to assure her, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he flicked the reins, urging the horses faster toward the farm that was no longer just his. The wagon crested a low hill, and the Harper farm came into view. A squat cabin of weathered logs, a sagging barn, and a vegetable garden that looked pitifully small under the vast Colorado sky. The fences needed mending, the chimney smoked too much, and the well was prone to freezing. Daniel had always seen it as enough for a bachelor, a place to rebuild after the war took his brother. Now it looked like a cruel joke, too small to house 7 souls through a brutal winter. The children fell silent, their eyes tracing the property with a mix of hope and resignation. Anna whispered something to Matthew, who shook his head, his small hands tightening on the wagon's edge. Daniel pulled the wagon to a stop and helped the children down, their bare feet stirring dust in the late afternoon light. Sarah carried Lily, who clung to her doll with a fierceness that belied her age. Lucas coughed again, a wet, desperate sound that made Daniel's heart clench. "Inside," he said, gesturing toward the cabin. "Let's get you settled." The word settled felt like a lie, but he pushed the thought aside and led them through the creaking door. The cabin's interior was as sparse as the outside. A single room with a stone hearth, a rickety table, and a narrow bed tucked against the wall. A ladder led to a loft barely big enough for one. The air smelled of wood smoke and earth, and the light filtering through the single window did little to soften the stark reality. Sarah set Lily on the floor, where the baby promptly began to chew on her doll's ear. The other children stood clustered near the door, their eyes darting from the bare shelves to Daniel's face, as if waiting for him to change his mind. "I'll start a fire," Daniel said, moving to the hearth to escape their gazes. He knelt, stacking kindling with hands that trembled slightly. The truth was clawing at him. He had no plan, no resources, no idea how to be a father to 6 children who had already lost everything. His brother's face flashed in his mind, pale and pleading as he bled out on a battlefield Daniel could not reach. He had failed then. Could he fail again? Sarah knelt beside him, her small hands deftly arranging the kindling. "I can help," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've done this before, back at the orphanage." Daniel glanced at her, struck by the steadiness in her brown eyes. She was 12, maybe 13, but carried herself like someone twice her age. Her matted hair framed a face smudged with dirt, but there was a fire in her that refused to dim, even after all she had seen. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, the words feeling inadequate. She nodded, striking a match with a practiced flick. The kindling caught, casting a warm glow across the room. For a moment, the crackle of the fire was the only sound, a fragile barrier against the weight of the unknown. Daniel stood, brushing soot from his hands, and turned to face the children. They had spread out slightly, Anna and Benjamin exploring the corners of the room while Lucas sat against the wall, his breathing shallow. Lily had crawled to Sarah, who was now braiding her hair with gentle fingers. The sight stirred something in Daniel, a pang of protectiveness, sharp and unfamiliar. These children were not his, yet they were here, in his home, looking to him for safety. "Papa Daniel," Sarah said, her voice low so the others would not hear, "there's something I need to tell you. Something Miss Elizabeth made me promise to keep secret until we were safe." She glanced at the door as if expecting someone to burst through it. Daniel's pulse quickened, the hairs on his neck prickling. "What is it?" he asked, kneeling to meet her gaze. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the fear she had kept hidden until now. Sarah leaned closer, her whisper barely audible. "Miss Elizabeth said our parents didn't die in a factory fire?" "They found something in the mine, something the owners didn't want anyone to know. Someone killed them to keep it quiet." Her eyes flicked to Lily's doll, clutched tightly in the baby's arms, and Miss Elizabeth hid proof of it. "It's sewn inside Lily's doll." Daniel's blood ran cold. The cabin, the children, the meager life he had built, all of it suddenly felt like a target. He glanced at the window, where the last light of day bled into dusk, and wondered what shadows were already closing in. Elizabeth had not just given him 6 children. She had given him a secret worth killing for, and the weight of that promise was heavier than he could have imagined. The fire in Daniel Harper's cabin cast flickering shadows across the log walls, but the warmth did little to ease the chill that had settled in his bones. Sarah's whispered revelation hung in the air like smoke. Her parents' deaths were no accident, and the proof was hidden in Lily's ragged doll, a secret that had already cost lives. Daniel's gaze darted to the baby, who slept fitfully on a blanket near the hearth, her tiny fingers curled around the doll's worn fabric. The other children, Lucas, Matthew, Anna, and Benjamin, were sprawled across the floor, their exhaustion finally overtaking their fear. Sarah alone remained awake, her brown eyes fixed on Daniel, waiting for him to speak. He rose, his boots heavy on the creaking floorboards, and moved to the cabin's single window. The Colorado night pressed against the glass, a vast darkness broken only by the faint glow of stars. He scanned the horizon, searching for movement, but saw only the skeletal outlines of his barn and the swaying pines beyond. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. Someone killed them to keep it quiet. If the mine owners had murdered to protect their secret, they would not hesitate to hunt 6 children and a lone farmer. Daniel's hand rested on the windowsill, his calloused fingers tracing the rough wood. He had survived the war, faced death in the chaos of battle, but this was different. This was personal, and he was no longer fighting for himself alone. "Papa Daniel?" Sarah's voice was soft, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. She had moved to his side, her small frame tense with the weight of her confession. "Miss Elizabeth said the men who killed our parents followed us from Kansas City. She saw them on the train platform before she got sick. They're still out there." Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the night. "Did she say what they looked like?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the pulse hammering in his throat. Sarah shook her head, her matted hair falling across her face. "Only that they were rough men, with hard eyes. One had a scar across his cheek like a claw mark." She hugged her arms, shivering despite the fire's warmth. "Miss Elizabeth said they'd do anything to get those papers. That's why she sewed them into Lily's doll. Nobody would think to look there." Daniel glanced at the sleeping baby, the doll tucked against her chest. The innocence of the toy mocked the danger it concealed. He had taken in these children thinking his greatest challenge would be feeding them through winter. Now he was entangled in a conspiracy that reached beyond Copper Ridge, one that had already claimed Elizabeth and the children's parents. His military instincts, dulled by years of farming, stirred awake. He needed to protect the evidence, but more than that, he needed to protect the children. The thought of failing them, as he had failed his brother at Shiloh, was a knife in his gut. "Go get some rest, Sarah," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'll keep watch tonight." She hesitated, her eyes searching his face for reassurance, then nodded and returned to the blanket where Lily slept. Daniel waited until her breathing slowed, then retrieved his Winchester rifle from its peg by the door. The familiar weight of the weapon steadied him, grounding his racing thoughts. He had not fired it since hunting deer last spring, but the muscle memory of his war years remained sharp. He settled into a chair by the window, the rifle across his lap, and listened to the night. The wind hissed through the pines, carrying the faint scent of frost and earth. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, set his nerves on edge. He thought of Elizabeth, her elegant handwriting now a desperate plea from beyond the grave. She had believed in him, seen a goodness he doubted himself. That faith was all that kept him from crumbling under the weight of his fear. Hours passed, the fire dwindling to embers. Daniel's eyes grew heavy, but he forced himself to stay alert, scanning the darkness for any sign of trouble. Just as dawn's first light bled across the horizon, a sound snapped him upright, the faint crunch of gravel under boots coming from the direction of the barn. He gripped the rifle, his heart pounding. It could be a coyote or old Pete checking his traps early. But Sarah's warning about rough men with hard eyes made him doubt it was anything so innocent. He eased the door open, wincing at the faint creak, and slipped outside, keeping low. The air was sharp, stinging his lungs as he moved toward the barn, the rifle raised. The gravel path was empty, but a shadow shifted near the fence line. A figure, too tall for an animal, moving with purpose. Daniel's breath caught. He crouched behind a stack of firewood, his eyes tracking the figure as it paused, then melted back into the trees. A second shadow followed, then a third, their movements coordinated, predatory. Daniel's mind raced. 3 men stalking his property at dawn could only mean one thing. They were here for the doll. He thought of the children sleeping inside, defenseless if these men breached the cabin. His first instinct was to confront them, to drive them off with a warning shot. But his war experience held him back. He was 1 man against 3, and if they were the killers Sarah described, they would not hesitate to slaughter everyone to get what they wanted. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. He slipped back into the cabin, locking the door behind him. Sarah was awake, sitting up with wide eyes, as if she had sensed the danger.
"What's wrong?"
she whispered, her voice trembling. "Men outside," Daniel said, keeping his tone calm. "Stay with the others. If I tell you to run, take the children to the creek bed behind the garden and hide. Understand?" Sarah nodded, her face pale but resolute. She moved to Lily, gently lifting the baby and her doll, and gathered the other children, who stirred with sleepy confusion. Daniel returned to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. The shadows had vanished, but he knew they were still out there, watching, waiting for an opening. He checked the rifle's chamber, the click of metal loud in the quiet cabin. The children's safety depended on his next move, but the truth gnawed at him. He was not just protecting them from hunger or cold anymore. He was up against men who had killed before and would kill again, and the papers in Lily's doll were the only leverage he had. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Daniel heard another sound. Hooves, faint but growing louder, coming from the main road. He tensed, expecting more trouble, but the rhythm was familiar. Marshal Grant, the territorial lawman, often rode this way on his rounds. Daniel's heart leapt with a flicker of hope. If he could signal Grant, he might have a chance to protect the children and expose the conspiracy before the killers closed in. But as he moved to the door, a new sound froze him in place. A low, deliberate whistle from the trees, answered by another from the opposite side of the property. The men were signaling, coordinating their approach. Daniel's grip on the rifle tightened, his mind flashing to the children's faces, to Elizabeth's letter, to the promise he had made. The shadows were closing in, and with them, a danger that would test every ounce of his courage. He had survived battles before, but this was no battlefield. This was his home, and the lives of 6 children hung on his ability to outwit the predators circling in the dawn. The low whistle from the trees lingered in Daniel Harper's ears, a predator's signal that set his nerves ablaze. The dawn light spilled across his Colorado farm, glinting off the frost-kissed grass, but the beauty of the morning was a cruel mask for the danger closing in. 3 men, hunters of the secret sewn into Lily's doll, were circling his property, their movements deliberate, like wolves tightening around prey. Daniel stood by the cabin's window, his Winchester rifle a cold weight in his hands, his eyes scanning the tree line for any flicker of motion. Inside, Sarah huddled with the other children, Lucas, Matthew, Anna, Benjamin, and Lily, her face pale but resolute as she whispered to keep them calm. The hoofbeats Daniel had heard moments ago grew louder, a steady rhythm that promised hope. Marshal Grant's patrols often passed this way, and if Daniel could signal him, the lawman's presence might scare off the killers, but the whistles told him time was short. He glanced at Sarah, who clutched Lily's doll with a fierceness that belied her 12 years. The papers hidden inside, proof of a conspiracy that had murdered her parents, were a death sentence if the men outside got their hands on them. Daniel's jaw clenched. He had survived Confederate ambushes in Missouri, but this fight was for 6 lives that depended on him alone. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and steady despite the pulse hammering in his throat. "Take the children to the root cellar. Bar the door and stay quiet no matter what you hear." Sarah nodded, her eyes flickering with fear but also trust. She gathered the children, guiding them toward the kitchen where a trapdoor led to the cramped cellar below. Lucas coughed, a wet, desperate sound that cut through Daniel's heart, but the boy followed without complaint, his thin frame trembling. Lily whimpered, clutching her doll as Sarah carried her down the ladder. The trapdoor closed with a soft thud, leaving Daniel alone in the silent cabin. He moved to the door, easing it open just enough to peer outside. The hoofbeats were closer now, but so were the killers. A shadow shifted near the barn, then another by the fence line. Daniel's grip on the rifle tightened, his war-honed instincts mapping their positions. 3 men, spreading out to surround the cabin, likely armed and ready to kill. He could not wait for Grant, if the marshal was even coming. He needed to act, to draw the men away from the children and buy time. Before he could move, a voice cut through the morning air, rough and commanding. "Harper, we know you've got those kids in there!" "Hand over the doll and we might let you walk away." The speaker stepped into view, a tall man with a thick black beard and eyes like chipped flint, a revolver glinting in his hand. 2 others flanked him, a younger man with a scar slashing across his cheek and a wiry figure with a rifle slung low. They stood at the edge of the yard, their postures radiating menace, the bearded leader's gaze locked on the cabin. Daniel's heart pounded, but he stepped onto the porch, the rifle raised but not aimed. "These children are under my protection," he called, his voice carrying the steel of a man who had faced death before. "You've got no business here. Leave now, or you'll answer to the law." The bearded man laughed, a sound like gravel grinding in a bucket. "Law don't scare us, farmer. Those kids are carrying something that belongs to our employer. Give us the doll, or we start shooting." The scarred man smirked, his fingers twitching toward his holster, while the wiry one shifted, eyeing the cabin's windows. Daniel's mind raced. Giving them the doll was no guarantee of safety. These men had tracked the children across 3 states, killed their parents, and likely Elizabeth Carter. They would not leave witnesses, but every second he stalled was a second closer to Grant's arrival, if the hoofbeats were indeed his. He needed to keep them talking, keep them distracted. "The doll's just a child's toy," Daniel said, forcing a note of confusion into his voice. What's it to you? If it's money you're after, I've got savings. Take it and go. He took a step forward, drawing their eyes to him, away from the cabin where the children hid. The bearded man's eyes narrowed, his patience fraying. Don't play dumb, Harper. We know what's inside that doll. Hand it over, or we burn this place down with you and those brats in it. He nodded to the scarred man who pulled a tin of kerosene from his coat and began splashing it on the barn's dry wood. The sharp, acrid smell hit Daniel's nostrils, igniting a surge of panic. Fire in this dry autumn grass would spread fast, too fast to control. "Stop!" Daniel shouted, raising the rifle to his shoulder. "You set that fire, you'll destroy whatever you're after. Think about what your employer will do if you come back empty-handed." The scarred man hesitated, glancing at the bearded leader who cursed under his breath. Daniel's bluff had bought a moment, but it would not last. The wiry man grew impatient, his rifle snapping up. "Enough talk! Let's end this!" Before Daniel could react, the man fired, the bullet splintering the doorframe inches from his head. Instinct took over. Daniel dove to the side, rolling into the shadow of the porch as another shot shattered the cabin's window. Glass rained onto the floor inside, and from the cellar he heard a muffled cry. Lily, her voice piercing the chaos. Daniel's blood roared in his ears. He crawled to the corner of the porch, peering around the edge. The bearded man was advancing, revolver raised, while the scarred man struck a match, the tiny flame flaring in the dawn light. With a flick, he tossed it onto the kerosene-soaked barn. The wood caught instantly, orange flames licking upward, the crackle of burning timber drowning out the fading hoofbeats. The fire was no longer a threat. It was a reality, and it was spreading toward the cabin. "Get out here, Harper!" the bearded man bellowed, firing another shot that thudded into the porch. "You can't hide forever!" Smoke billowed from the barn, thick and choking, curling across the yard. Daniel's eyes stung, but he forced himself to focus. The children were in the cellar, but the fire would reach them soon, the smoke seeping through the floorboards. He had to act, to draw the men away and give the children a chance to escape. He sighted down the rifle, aiming for the scarred man who was now splashing more kerosene on the fence. Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger, years of war guiding his hand. The shot rang out clean and precise, and the scarred man dropped, clutching his chest, his kerosene tin clattering to the ground. The bearded man roared in rage, firing wildly at the porch, while the wiry man ducked behind a tree, his rifle searching for a target. Daniel had evened the odds, but the fire was growing, flames leaping from the barn to the dry grass, racing toward the cabin's back wall. The heat was palpable now, a wall of blistering air that made his skin prickle. He thought of Sarah, her trust in him, and Lucas's cough, Lily's doll, the weight of Elizabeth's promise. He could not let them die, not like this. "Sarah!" he shouted, praying she could hear him through the cellar door. "Get the children to the creek bed! Run, now!" He fired another shot to keep the bearded man pinned, then rolled off the porch, sprinting toward the cabin's side where the shadows might give him cover. The fire roared behind him, a beast unleashed, and the killer's shouts grew louder, their desperation matching his own. The hoofbeats were gone, hope fading with them, and Daniel knew the next moments would decide whether he and the children lived or burned. The roar of the fire drowned out all else, a relentless beast consuming Daniel Harper's farm with greedy tongues of orange and red. Smoke stung his eyes as he crouched in the shadow of the cabin's sidewall, the Winchester rifle slick with sweat in his hands. The barn was a blazing skeleton, its timbers collapsing in showers of sparks, and the flames had leapt to the dry grass, racing toward the cabin where 6 children hid in the root cellar. The bearded killer and his wiry accomplice were still out there, their shouts cutting through the crackle of burning wood, their guns hungry for the papers sewn into Lily's doll. Daniel's heart pounded, each beat a reminder of the lives depending on his next move. He had taken down one of the killers, the scarred man lying lifeless near the barn, but the odds were still against him. The fire was spreading too fast, the heat searing his skin even from a distance, and the smoke was thick, curling into the cabin through shattered windows. Sarah and the children, Lucas, Matthew, Anna, Benjamin, and Lily, were trapped below, and Daniel knew the cellar would soon become a death trap as smoke seeped through the floorboards. His shout for them to run to the creek bed had been a desperate hope, but he could not see if they had escaped, and the thought of them choking in the dark twisted his gut. "Harper!" The bearded man's voice was a snarl, closer now, coming from the front of the cabin. "You're only making this harder. Give us the doll or we burn those kids alive." A gunshot punctuated his words, the bullet splintering the cabin's corner just above Daniel's head. He ducked lower, his mind racing. The killers were advancing, using the fire as a weapon to flush him out. He needed to draw them away, to give Sarah a chance to get the children to safety. But the flames were closing in, a wall of heat that narrowed his options with every passing second. Daniel peered around the corner, his eyes watering from the smoke. The bearded man stood in the yard, revolver raised, his face twisted with rage. The wiry man was circling to the side, rifle at the ready, his movements cautious but determined. The fire had reached the cabin's back wall, the dry logs catching with a whoosh that sent sparks swirling into the sky. Daniel's throat burned, each breath a struggle, but he forced himself to focus. He had fought in worse odds during the war, ambushed by raiders who left no mercy for the weak. Those years had taught him one truth: hesitation was death. He sighted the wiry man, who was creeping toward the kitchen side of the cabin, likely aiming to cut off any escape. Daniel steadied the rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. The shot cracked through the chaos, and the wiry man staggered, clutching his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the ground. He cursed, stumbling behind a tree, but Daniel had no time to finish him. The bearded man was moving, firing wildly as he charged the porch, his boots pounding the earth like a war drum. Daniel rolled back into the shadows, his mind flashing to Sarah's face, her trust in him as she led the children to the cellar. He could not let her down, not like he had failed his brother at Shiloh, bleeding out in the mud while Daniel was too far to help. He sprinted to the front door, diving inside just as another bullet tore through the frame. The cabin was a haze of smoke, the air thick and toxic, and the heat from the burning back wall was unbearable. He crawled to the kitchen, his lungs screaming, and ripped open the cellar door. "Sarah!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get out now!" A small figure emerged, coughing violently. Sarah, with Lily in her arms, the baby's face blue from smoke, her doll clutched tightly. Behind her came Lucas, his coughs racking his frail body, then Matthew, Anna, and Benjamin, their eyes streaming with tears. The cellar was a death trap, the smoke pouring in faster than Daniel had feared. "Run to the creek bed," he ordered, pushing them toward the door. "Stay low and don't stop." Sarah hesitated, her eyes locking on his, a silent plea for him to come with them. But the bearded man's shouts were closer, his footsteps thudding on the porch. Daniel shook his head, his voice firm. "Go, Sarah, I'll hold them off." She nodded, tears cutting through the soot on her cheeks, and led the children out, their small forms disappearing into the smoke. Daniel turned back to the door, rifle raised, just as the bearded man kicked it open. The killer's eyes gleamed with triumph, his revolver aimed at Daniel's chest. "No more games, farmer," he growled. "Where's the doll?" Daniel's gaze flicked to the floor, where Lily's doll lay, dropped in Sarah's frantic escape. The papers inside were the only proof of the conspiracy, the only chance to bring justice for the children's parents. He lunged for it, but the bearded man was faster, his boot pinning the doll to the floor. "Stupid move," he said, cocking the revolver. The fire roared louder, the back wall collapsing in a cascade of flames, and the heat was a physical force pressing against Daniel's skin. He knew giving up the doll would not save him. These men left no witnesses. With a surge of desperation, he threw himself at the killer, tackling him to the ground. The revolver fired, the bullet grazing Daniel's shoulder, a sharp burn that barely registered through the adrenaline. They grappled, the doll trapped beneath them, as the fire closed in, licking at the walls. Daniel's hands found the killer's wrist, twisting until the revolver skittered across the floor. The bearded man roared, pulling a knife from his belt, its blade glinting in the firelight. Daniel rolled to avoid the strike, but the blade caught his side, a searing pain that stole his breath. Blood soaked his shirt, but he fought on, driven by the image of Sarah and the children running through the smoke. He slammed his fist into the killer's jaw, stunning him long enough to grab the doll and stagger to his feet. The cabin was an inferno now, the roof beams groaning under the fire's weight. Daniel stumbled toward the door, the doll clutched to his chest, the crinkle of hidden papers a faint hope amid the chaos. The bearded man lunged after him, knife raised, but a sudden crack split the air. A burning beam crashed down, separating them in a wall of flame. The killer's scream was swallowed by the fire as Daniel burst onto the porch, gasping for air. Outside, the yard was a nightmare of smoke and embers, the grass blazing toward the wagon. Daniel's vision blurred, the pain in his side a pulsing agony, but he scanned the horizon for the children. Through the haze, he saw small figures moving toward the creek bed, Sarah's silhouette leading the way. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. The wiry man, wounded but alive, emerged from the smoke, his rifle aimed at the fleeing children. Daniel raised his own rifle, his hands shaking from blood loss. "Drop it!" he shouted, his voice raw. The wiry man turned, his eyes widening, but he did not lower the weapon. Daniel fired, the shot striking the man's chest, and he collapsed, his rifle falling uselessly to the ground. Daniel staggered, his strength fading, the doll still gripped in his hand. The fire was everywhere now, the cabin collapsing behind him, the flames racing toward the creek. He had to get to the children, to make sure they were safe, but his legs buckled, the world tilting as darkness crept into his vision. The last thing he heard was the thundering of hooves, faint but growing louder, and a voice, Marshal Grant's, sharp with urgency, calling his name. He clung to the doll, to the promise he had made, and prayed it was enough to save them all. Daniel Harper drifted in a haze of pain, the world reduced to fragments of sound and sensation. The acrid stench of smoke clung to his nostrils, mingling with the coppery tang of blood soaking his shirt. His side throbbed where the bearded killer's knife had bitten deep, and his shoulder burned from the grazing bullet, but the weight of Lily's doll in his hand anchored him to consciousness. The fire's roar had faded to a distant crackle, replaced by the thundering of hooves and a voice, Marshal Grant's, sharp and commanding, cutting through the chaos. "Harper, stay with me." Daniel's eyes fluttered open, the Colorado sky a blur of gray and gold above him, and he clung to the hope that the children had reached the creek bed. Strong hands pressed against his wound, the pain jolting him fully awake. Marshal Grant knelt beside him, his weathered face taut with urgency as he tore strips from his own shirt to staunch the bleeding. 2 deputies flanked him, their rifles trained on the smoldering ruins of the cabin, where flames still licked at the collapsed timbers. The bearded killer lay pinned beneath a deputy's boot, his wrists bound, his face a mask of rage and defeat. The wiry man and the scarred one were gone, dead, Daniel realized, their bodies claimed by the fire or his own bullets. The doll, its fabric singed but intact, rested in the dirt beside him, the hidden papers still safe within. "Easy, Harper," Grant said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "You're losing blood, but we'll get you patched up." "Where are the children?" Daniel struggled to speak, his throat raw from smoke. "Creek bed," he rasped, gesturing weakly toward the ravine beyond the burning grass. "Sarah took them. Safe, I hope." Grant nodded, signaling one deputy to check the creek. The lawman's eyes flicked to the doll, his brow furrowing. "This what they were after?" he asked, lifting it carefully. Daniel managed a nod, wincing as Grant pressed harder on his wound.
Papers inside. Proof of a conspiracy. Mine owners. Stole silver. Killed to cover it.
His words came in gasps, each one a battle against the darkness creeping at the edges of his vision. Grant's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "I've heard whispers of trouble in the mines," he said. "If what you say is true, this goes high. Maybe to the governor's office." He tucked the doll into his saddlebag, his movements deliberate. "Rest now. We've got the bastard who's left, and those papers will hang him and his bosses." The deputy returned, his face breaking into a relieved grin. "Found the kids, Marshal. They're shaken but alive, hiding in the creek bed like Harper said." Daniel's chest loosened, a wave of relief cutting through the pain. Sarah had done it. She had kept them safe. He pictured her fierce eyes, her small hands guiding her siblings through the smoke, and something like pride swelled in him, mingled with gratitude for Elizabeth Carter's faith in them both. Grant's men worked quickly, dousing the smaller fires with water from the well and securing the bearded killer, who spat curses as they dragged him to the wagon. "You're all dead," the man snarled, his voice hoarse from smoke. "My employer will send more and they'll finish what I started." Grant silenced him with a sharp glare, his hand resting on his revolver. "You're talking to a territorial marshal, friend. Keep flapping and you'll be confessing to a noose." Daniel's strength was fading, his body heavy as lead, but he forced himself to focus as the deputy helped him sit up. Through the haze, he saw Sarah emerging from the creek bed, Lily in her arms, the other children trailing behind. Their faces were streaked with soot, their clothes torn, but they were alive. Lucas, coughing but upright. Matthew clinging to Anna's hand. Benjamin, his blanket dragging in the dirt. Sarah's eyes found Daniel's, and she ran to him, dropping to her knees beside him. "Papa Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling with relief and fear. "You're hurt." She reached for his hand, her fingers small but strong, and Daniel squeezed back, the pain secondary to the sight of her safe. "You did good, Sarah," he said, his voice thick. "You got them out." She nodded, tears cutting clean paths through the grime on her cheeks, and handed Lily to Anna, who cradled the baby with fierce protectiveness. Grant crouched beside them, his gaze softening as he looked at the children. "You're a brave bunch," he said, "and Harper here's a hero for keeping you alive." He turned to Daniel, his tone businesslike. "We've got the papers, and this one," he jerked a thumb at the bearded killer, "is already singing about his employer to save his skin. Silver theft, murder, treason with Confederate sympathizers. It's enough to bring down a whole network. You did more than save these kids, Harper. You've given us a chance to clean up this territory." Daniel's head swam, the marshal's words blurring together. He had fought to protect the children, not to uncover a conspiracy, but the weight of what he had done settled over him. The cabin was gone, reduced to smoldering ash, and his barn was a pile of charred beams. 5 years of building a life in Copper Ridge had burned away in minutes, yet as he looked at the children gathered around him, their eyes wide but trusting, he felt no loss. They were his now, not just a promise to Elizabeth, but a family he had chosen. The deputy brought a canteen and Daniel drank, the cool water easing the burn in his throat. Grant's men were loading the killer into the wagon, and the marshal was already planning the ride to Denver to deliver the papers to the territorial judge. "We'll get you to a doctor in town," Grant said, helping Daniel to his feet. "And these kids need food and rest. You got my word. They'll be cared for." Sarah stayed close, her hand still in Daniel's, and he drew strength from her presence. Lucas coughed again, but his color was better, the fresh air easing his labored breathing. Lily, reunited with her doll, nestled against Anna, her tiny face peaceful despite the chaos. Matthew and Benjamin stood together, their fear giving way to curiosity as they watched the deputy's work. Daniel's wounds ached, his body screaming for rest, but his mind was clear. He had faced death and won, not for himself, but for them. As the wagon rolled toward Copper Ridge, the sun climbed higher, its light piercing the smoke to paint the mountains in shades of gold. Daniel looked at the children, their small forms huddled together, and saw not just survivors but a future. The fire had taken his home, but it had forged something stronger, a bond that no flame could touch. He had been a lonely farmer waiting for a bride who never came, but now he was something more. A father, a protector, a man who had faced hell and emerged with 6 reasons to keep fighting. The wagon rattled along the road to Copper Ridge, its wheels kicking up dust that glowed in the late morning sun. Daniel Harper sat propped against a sack of grain, his side bandaged tightly by Marshal Grant's deputy, the pain a dull throb beneath the weight of exhaustion. The children, Sarah, Lucas, Matthew, Anna, Benjamin, and Lily, clustered around him, their small bodies pressed close as if afraid he might vanish. Sarah held Lily, whose doll, now emptied of its deadly papers, dangled from her tiny hands. Lucas's cough had eased, thanks to a dose of medicine from Grant's saddlebag, and the others shared a loaf of bread the deputies had provided, their hollow cheeks slowly regaining color. Daniel watched them, his heart a tangle of relief and resolve. The fire had taken everything, his cabin, his barn, 5 years of a solitary life, but it had given him something greater, a family. The smoldering ruins of his farm were far behind, but the memory of the flames, the bearded killer's knife, and the desperate fight for the children's lives lingered like smoke in his lungs. Marshal Grant rode ahead, the captured killer bound in the wagon's rear, his threats silenced by the lawman's stern presence. The papers from Lily's doll were safe in Grant's saddlebag, destined for a judge in Denver who would unravel the conspiracy that had cost the children's parents their lives. Daniel had not set out to be a hero, only to honor Elizabeth Carter's dying wish. But as he looked at the children, he felt the weight of what he had done. He had saved them, and in doing so, had saved himself from a life of loneliness. Sarah leaned against him, her brown eyes tracing the mountains that loomed against the horizon, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season.
Papa Daniel,
she said softly, her voice steady despite the ordeal.
What happens now?
We don't have a home anymore. Her words cut deeper than the knife wound, a reminder of the practical realities ahead. Winter was coming, and with no cabin, no savings, and 6 mouths to feed, the future was a daunting void. Daniel reached for her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping her small ones. "We'll find a way," he said, his voice firm with a conviction he was only beginning to feel. "You're with me now, all of you. We're a family, and families don't give up." Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile, and for the first time, Daniel saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a trust that made his chest ache with responsibility and love. Marshal Grant slowed his horse, dropping back to the wagon. His weathered face broke into a rare grin as he pulled a folded document from his coat. "Harper, you've earned more than just my respect today," he said, handing the paper to Daniel. "The territorial government's offering a reward for exposing this conspiracy. Enough to buy new land, build a proper house, and set up a trust for these children's education. Their parents died heroes, and you've made sure their sacrifice wasn't in vain." Daniel unfolded the document, his eyes scanning the official seal and the sum written in bold ink. It was more money than he had ever seen, enough to start over, to give the children the life Elizabeth had dreamed for them. He looked at Sarah, then at the others. Lucas, chewing thoughtfully on his bread, Anna braiding Lily's hair, Matthew and Benjamin whispering to each other with tentative excitement. The weight of the past day's terror began to lift, replaced by a vision of a future he could build with them. "Thank you, Marshal," Daniel said, his voice thick with gratitude. Grant waved it off, his eyes softening as he looked at the children. "You're the one who stood tall, Harper. Most men would have run from a fight like that. You didn't just save these kids, you gave them a father." The wagon rolled into Copper Ridge, drawing curious stares from the townsfolk who had judged Daniel's choice to take in the orphans. Old Pete stood outside the general store, his usual scowl replaced by a nod of respect. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, watched from her porch, her pursed lips softening as she saw the children's faces, alive and whole. Daniel met their gazes without shame, his back straight despite the pain. Let them stare. He had faced death for these children, and no judgment could touch that truth. At the town's small clinic, a doctor cleaned and stitched Daniel's wounds, his hands steady as he worked. The children waited outside, Sarah keeping them calm with stories of the farm they would build together. A big house with enough beds for everyone, a garden bursting with vegetables, a barn for horses they would learn to ride. Daniel listened through the open window, his heart swelling at her resilience. She was no longer just the oldest orphan. She was his daughter, fierce and unbreakable, a leader for her siblings. When the doctor finished, Daniel joined the children, easing himself onto a bench where Lily crawled into his lap, her doll pressed against his chest. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, the mountains standing sentinel over the valley. Daniel looked at each child, their faces dirty but alive, their eyes holding a fragile hope that he had fought to preserve. He thought of Elizabeth, her letter a fading echo, and realized she had given him more than a responsibility. She had given him a purpose. "Papa Daniel," Anna said, her voice small but clear, "can we really stay together? All of us?" She clutched Matthew's hand, her eyes searching his face for the answer she needed. Daniel reached out, touching her cheek gently, then Lucas's shoulder, Benjamin's hair, Sarah's arm. "Forever," he said, the word a vow etched into his soul. "We're a family now, and families stick together no matter what." The children leaned closer, their warmth a shield against the uncertainties ahead. Lily yawned, her doll slipping from her grasp, and Daniel caught it, tucking it back into her arms with a tenderness that felt as natural as breathing. As the last light faded, Daniel Harper looked at his new family, their silhouettes framed against the glowing sky. He had lost a bride, a home, a life he had planned with careful hope. But in their place, he had gained 6 children, each one a spark of courage and love that no fire could extinguish. The road ahead would be hard, winter's bite, the challenge of rebuilding, the shadow of a conspiracy that might still hunt them. Yet as he held them close, Daniel knew he was no longer the lonely farmer waiting for a stranger's love. He was their father, their protector, and the man he had always been meant to become. The greatest blessings, he realized, often came disguised as the worst disasters, and in the ashes of his old life, he had found a home that would endure. Shy Farmer expected a bride, but the train brought him 6 street kids instead.